Present our next work. Last year, Alissa Rubin wrote one of the most powerful stories anywhere, a horrifying account of a young Afghan woman who was beaten to death by a mob of crazed men, run over by a car, dragged along the street and set afire, after being accused falsely of burning a Quran. The murder of 27-year-old Farah Kunduz became Alissa's obsession, to write the definitive account of the events that led to Farah Kunduz's killing, and to find out who was responsible. She interviewed more than 50 people. She also traveled to Tajikistan to meet with Farah Kunduz's family. She traced the woman's steps on the day she died, stopping to talk to every shopkeeper and tailor who had been in the vicinity of the shrine. Alissa's story was accompanied by a chilling 8-minute video that showed every step of Farah Kunduz's torment, from the accusations taking hold and the first blows being struck to her battered body set afire. You can watch this video, by the way, on the New York Times website. Alissa's reporting explained why there was such impunity for crimes against women. The US alone spent more than $1 billion to train lawyers and judges to improve legal protections for women. Millions in foreign funds have been poured into girls' schools and women's shelters aimed at elevating women's status. But these programs often foundered because, as Alissa has said, repressive views of women were deeply embedded in society. And Western efforts to uplift women have provoked fierce resentment from powerful religious figures and ordinary Afghans. These are stories that are difficult and dangerous to tell. Alissa traveled on roads guarded by the Taliban to report on Afghan women brought into the police force to help put a stop to the practice of honor killings. She selected the police force because the Americans had invested a lot there. Particularly, she knew that she had chosen the right target when one of the women she had interviewed was murdered. To report on shelters set up to protect women who feared being killed by their own families, Alissa traveled and stayed in Baghlan province, which was unstable and dangerous. She spent hours talking to women who were traumatized and afraid to speak out. She slept and ate in the shelters, meditated with the young women, dressed like the young women, and she won their confidence. Alissa's coverage, not just for her story, but for her in her long career as an international correspondent, is distinguished by her courageous and sensitive portrayal of how war deforms societies. She is subtle and non-judgmental. I always try to imagine myself as both a victim and a perpetrator, she said, and then ask people questions to help me see the world from their point of view. In Alissa's world, there are few heroes. There are few pure heroes or pure villains. For her quiet courage and her commitment to telling the stories of women whose voices are rarely heard, Alissa Rubin was awarded this year's Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting. Alissa, Farah Kunduz's death was not an isolated incident, as you reported. But why this obsession with one woman's death?
Well, I think one reason was that it wasn't a death, it wasn't a killing that happened in a remote area. It happened in the middle of Kabul, in an extremely populated place, and there were many, many policemen present at the time of her murder. So it seemed an extraordinary level of complicity by many people in the society, and I think that was what most struck me. And initially, right after it happened, even people in the government spoke, came out and said it was the right thing to do, that she'd burned the Quran, without asking really any follow-up questions. So I think that was quite distinctive. And this wasn't an honor killing. Honor killings are more common, but this was really a lynching. And to see something like this with so many people, these weren't all crazy men at the end of the day. They were ordinary men, and that was what was so frightening about it, because if it could happen to her once, it could happen to any other woman on any other day.
So this killing was widely reported in Afghanistan. Or this killing was well known and reported already in
Yes,
Afghanistan,
it was reported in
right?
Afghanistan, yes.
So why did you decide to revisit it and to spend so much time trying to reconstruct what actually happened?
Well, I actually wasn't there when the original event happened, so one of the things I felt I had to do was go back and really understand it. But what interested me was trying to look at whether justice was done, because if you're going to change society, you sort of have to go at it from a lot of points of view, and justice was one of the areas, the legal system and the courts was one of the areas that the Americans and the Europeans both had invested a lot of money in. So one of the questions was, when it's tested with something like this, how well does it work? And so as I began to work on that, and it actually turned out to be much more, what's the right word, sort of far-ranging than I recognized, because it's a question of why were the police who were there. I mean, part of the legal system is, and the justice system is, the law enforcement system. So why did the police do what they did? Why were some people picked up? In fact, many people were picked up and put in jail, but some of the people who were easily visible on the video footage were allowed to leave town. You know, there were sort of levels and levels of questions about the entire law enforcement system, the level of corruption in it, the level of complicity by people high up in the government. And then we ultimately got to the trial. So I thought it would be interesting to look at how difficult it is to actually change something as complicated as a justice system when there are cultural beliefs that kind of trump everything else.
So you're an American woman working in Afghanistan, which is a very dangerous area to work in. How did you even get the women, especially, who usually remain silent in cultures where women's voices are not valued, how do you get the women to talk to you?
Well, I was very, very fortunate. I had wonderful women translators who worked with me, because some women spoke Dari and some spoke Pashto, and you really had to have the right person for each interview. So that certainly helps, but also spending a lot of time and not seeming to just want to get a quote or a quick comment from them, because they don't often know how to talk very well because people haven't talked to them much. So the first few interviews are often, many of the women were monosyllabic, so you couldn't get them to actually tell a story. But if you said something like, well, how many sisters do you have? And they would say, well, 6. And they would say, well, really 4. And you'd say, well, 4 or 6. And they'd say, well, 2 of them died. You go, oh, okay. How many brothers? And you'd sort of slowly show that you actually cared about them. And then gradually you can come back to your actual story. It's very painstaking. I would easily spend 3 hours on a first interview in which I learned almost nothing and didn't even know if I should come back for the second one, because I couldn't tell if I'd actually start to get what I was looking for.
So where did these interviews take place?
They almost all have to take place in homes, because women can't go out. So you go to their homes, or occasionally you can meet them in a mosque, maybe. But that's difficult, because in general mosques are for men, but there's some places where there are women's days at the mosque. But mostly they were in homes. I would go to homes, or in a shelter, you go into the shelter, so you have to get permission to go into the shelter, and then you have to kind of get rid of the shelter employees, because they won't say everything in front of them, because they often believe that, and sometimes rightly, that they're in some way indebted to the family or connected to the family.
What about talking to the men? You said, you talked to a number of people who were there in the vicinity of the killing, but it was like collective amnesia, right? Many of them said they...
Yes, yeah. It was like a mafia killing. They would say, oh, the thing I heard most often was, I think my translator and I counted, we had 7 different shopkeepers who said, oh, I was in Mazar-e Sharif that day, which is like 300 miles away. It was completely ridiculous that they would have all suddenly, a vast exodus to Balkh province, which is quite remote from Kabul. And you couldn't drive there at the time because the roads were so dangerous. But so eventually you'd get people, you just have to keep going until you find people who are willing to say something. And often it's that there's someone else in the room. So I interviewed a couple of tailors when their customers were there, and they said, oh, they were in Balkh province. And then I came back on my way back and said, oh, we were looking for such and such. And they said, oh, well, one person you want to talk to is that guy over there, 3 stores down, because he was here. He said, and I was here for part of it, And so you sort of gradually, inch by inch, it just is, you have to be more curious than you are scared or impatient.
Did any of the men you interviewed actually admitted their complicity in the entire?
Yeah, well, I interviewed people in prison.
Yeah.
And who were there for the crime and who were on the video. And yeah, they admitted it, but one of them said he dropped this very heavy, large stone on her, but he was sure that she was already dead, so it was okay. It was just a symbolic thing. It wasn't actually to kill her. And the other one was someone who was actually the kind of the keeper, the custodian of the mosque, and he really would never admit it. He just denied everything.
So you had the interviews, you had the video. What other evidence did you put together to be able to tell this story?
Well, I think the family evidence was quite amazing, and they, first of all, they had gotten there quite quickly, and they had been able, they'd seen her body, they had looked at, they had talked to the police who were there, so they had a lot of, as close as you could get to firsthand and sympathetic as I could have hoped for. They were also, though, really, really wanted asylum in the United States and wanted me to promise that I would help them get asylum here. And it didn't matter how many times I told them that I didn't work for the government, I couldn't help them get asylum. And eventually they decided to stop talking to me because I couldn't get them asylum. And it was a very, very frustrating thing. I spent about 7 or 8 hours with them one day, and I'm very glad I did it, because then they said we could come back the next day, but then wouldn't let us come back. And we did a few more questions through a lawyer, but they felt like they couldn't bear to talk about it anymore.
To do this story, and there are other stories in this series about honor killings and the police women, you had to go to some places which were not safe, neither for Afghans nor for Americans. So what precautions did you take?
Well, I guess, when you're working in Afghanistan, you go to a lot of places that aren't safe all the time. It's just part of reporting there. And you try to minimize as much as you can the risk by planning your trips really carefully. And certainly being at a paper like the New York Times is a huge advantage, because they have a security advisor and you spend time really talking through every trip. And I'm a great believer that you can do almost anything in a war zone, not everything, but almost anything if you plan it carefully enough. So maybe you can't get to the very front line of a battle, but you can get to the area right behind it, and you can interview the people coming out of it. And you'll get an enormous amount, and you won't get killed, and therefore you'll be able to write the story. So I kind of used that philosophy for everything I did. And you also have to know when to leave. So if someone says, I think it's time to go, if your translator says that, you don't ask any questions, you just leave.
Your reconstruction of the killing is really compelling writing. Can you tell us a little bit about, the writing process and the structuring of the story? How did you decide on the chronology of it, and what details to include, and what the main theme that you wanted to emerge from?
I think with the Farah Kunduz story, it was actually very interesting, and it was really an example, and it's a little bit what Robin and Megan were talking about too. It's really important to not be afraid to go back over something that's already been published in other places, because there had been coverage of this murder, including in the New York Times, but I don't think it was even on the front page. I'm not sure. Maybe it was on the front page briefly, one edition or something. But it is all in the telling, and sometimes you can't get enough clarity in an early story, when something is still news, and it actually does take going back and reconstructing and spending time knowing what the order of things are. And we didn't have the video when I wrote the story. We were still gathering the video because it was really, really hard to get it, because we were trying to use raw footage, and that was really hard to find. And so I basically kept going over. I had like about 8 different versions of chronology from different people's points of view, and then I would try to reconcile them, and there were a couple of people who were more reliable than others, so I would keep going back to them and saying, well, do you think this happened first or that happened first? And memory is deceptive, and it's, you're never positive you've got it right. But I think I felt like I had to remind people how horrible this was, because when I talked to editors about it at the paper, they went, really? That happened? And you would say, yes, and it was in our paper. And they would go, oh, well, I guess I missed that, which of course we all do, with terrible stories every day. And but that made me know that I had to start with the horror of it, and then I could take it forward.
I'd like to invite our audience to ask questions. Can you go to the microphone, please? And if there are others who want to ask questions, please approach the mic.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Tian from J School. So I'd like to ask a question on the being non-judgmental. So do you feel angry about the crime against these women? And how did you handle your anger when you were interviewing these murders?
I don't really feel angry per se. That's not my feeling. I feel like I have to find a way to make other people feel angry. And that's mostly what I think about when I'm writing, so that and how I can make other people kind of cry. Because it doesn't do any good if I sit there and cry or get angry. What does some good, I hope, is that other people get upset and see what's wrong and begin to think creatively about what could change.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Annette, and I was just wondering how the men were treated in the prisons. Were they seen kind of as, sad to say, but like heroes, or how were they viewed in the prisons or even in the community following what happened that you spoke to?
Well, it really depends. I think men who have persecuted or harassed or raped women, police women, are not seen badly at all. I think if you're a policewoman, the presumption is you probably are a prostitute. And so I think that they're seen as doing what you would do. And it's changing a little bit in some places, but it's very slow. In the case of Farah Kunduz, I would be lying if I tried to present myself as knowing, because you're not in the prisons and you don't really see how people are treated, either how people are treated by the experience of being in an Afghan prison, which is a pretty horrible thing, or by how they're perceived by others. But, I don't think that crimes against women are seen quite the same way, but I couldn't say that for sure.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name's Locke. My question is, being someone from the West, culturally, how do you feel about this as being like a religious offense, and how to keep it from like being investigative reporting rather than just an op-ed piece? Like, what was your struggle with that?
Well, I guess the thing that most struck me is that the way, it's not really a religious view that I mean, if the woman had really burned the Quran, there actually is a procedure in Islam for figuring out why they burnt it and then a punishment for that. And this really fell outside of both the Islamic way of thinking of it and any kind of Western idea of justice. And so it was, what I thought was more interesting was that the way in which they decided to do justice in this case. They arrested, detained many people and sentenced many of them to prison, but they didn't really care whether or not they'd gotten the right people. So it was more like ticking a box. Oh yeah, we know this is a crime, it's bad, let's take care of it, but not let's reach a just decision. And I think that was what, for me, was the most worrisome, was that we, as the United States, we spend all this money on these programs, and then they don't actually seem to be absorbed at all. So what are we doing wrong? We're doing something very wrong.
Hi, I'm Allie. I wrote my question down because I'm really nervous. So as a woman who mainly focuses on conflict overseas and being in such an intense specialty, what has that experience been like for you specifically as a woman? And what is it like for you when you go home at the end of the day after covering such intense topics?
Well, I imagine it's this, I mean, I don't know, but when I've talked to my male colleagues, I think it's pretty similar. It's not really different. You feel discouraged to see things where people are mistreated, no matter whether you're male or female. You feel helpless as a reporter, I think, a lot, because no matter, I mean, you work at it every day, but it's really wonderful when you can actually see the results as the AP team did. And you know, I feel like my reporting, it adds to the general knowledge, but I think you're always rather disappointed with the impact you're able to have, because the injustices are very large, and the most you're able to do is kind of shine a light on them for a period of time, and then some things go on. So I mean, I think mostly you do it because you believe that otherwise you couldn't live with yourself. So that's how I feel at the end of the day.
Thank you, Alissa.